Hi and welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jacob Carter. He studies and reports on how science influences government decision-making. He's an expert in scientific integrity, science-informed policy processes, and holds a Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology. He runs the SciLight newsletter, a newsletter for people who want to stand up to defend science and science-based policymaking from those who would politicize it. He's a former intern of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So it's great to have you on here. I'm a former intern of the legislative branch, and I did apply to that internship at OSTP, but I didn't get it for like a million different reasons. But I'm really excited to see your newsletter. You have a newsletter that talks about the politicization of science. So tell us about SciLight.
Yeah, SciLight is a newsletter that I began earlier this year. There are three co-editors. My other two co-editors are Dr. Andrew Rosenberg, who is a former director of the National Marine Fisheries Service, and then Kathleen Rest, who is a former acting director of the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health. So it is a newsletter that is, run and co-edited by, we're all former, federal scientists, have experience in federal agencies working as scientists. And then we've also extensively researched the politicization of science and science-informed decision making. And so that's what we cover. That's what we look out for. We look out for stories that are hitting the news or things that we're hearing from agency scientists or from other nonprofit organizations that have that sort of leaning to them, but maybe haven't had expertise like we have, in which we can provide some additional context and expert information on why these issues are so important and why the public should care about them.
Right. So as we're interviewing, Donald Trump has just been reelected as president. And one thing I wanted to ask you about is that on the campaign trail, or maybe before, he expressed disappointment that nobody ever thanked him for developing the COVID vaccines, not even his own supporters in many cases. And why do you think the Trump administration doesn't get enough credit for this, which was the most massive vaccine research effort, very costly, and probably the most well-established vaccine push in the history of mankind? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I've actually written a blog about this for when I was a scientist with my former employer, the Union of Concerned Scientists, where I started doing a lot of this work on scientific integrity and science-based decision-making. I figured this would happen at some point. I guess it did kind of happen during the height of the pandemic. But one thing that I noted was that, it's really not the administration who can take credit for the development of those vaccines. They may have provided support and funding, and I think should be credited for that, but it's really the scientists, right? The scientists in the organizations who were doing the day-to-day work, researching and making progress on developing those vaccines. So I wrote a blog that said that is who we should be thanking, right? We should be thanking the scientists who gained the knowledge and did the research to really push out those vaccines. Those are really sort of the unsung heroes behind the scenes.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So you're right that a lot of that was done in the executive branch, I guess, like at the NIH and with industry and everything. It's interesting to me as an observer of our political times that the Trump administration executive branch has been very fast in selecting cabinet picks. Just today, Donald Trump picked Jay Bhattacharya to lead the National Institutes of Health. He chose RFK Jr., who's famous for his stance on vaccines and everything, and to lead HHS. And the interesting part to me is that these are very popular picks, even though scientists have called them out as anti-science. And there's a comms firm called Purple Strategies, and they wrote a LinkedIn post. Purple Strategies says that trust the science doesn't cut it anymore for people trying to sell products. So I wonder, what does that mean for scientists? Because historically, science has happened in the executive branch, like such as the NIH and all of those different research organizations and that's where we fund our research, but the Chevron doctrine has weakened that now. So it's more under the purview of legislative and judicial branches to have science, and those places don't really have scientists, like hired staff scientists usually. So it's kind of two issues. It's like the weakening of the executive branch science, as well as the people, I guess, demanding a different type of engagement with science. So what do you think that means for executive branch science going forward?
I think the scientific workforce in the executive branch that exists across these agencies is still very, very strong. You know, across like the past 4 years and even under the Trump administration, scientists still achieved quite a lot. I mean, we just talked about the COVID-19 vaccines, right? And how quickly those vaccines were able to be developed and get out to the public. The Pew Center releases surveys. They have been doing a long-term survey on trust in science. And their most recent survey, if you look at it, actually shows that trust in science has actually increased. So I don't think that trust in scientists has necessarily gone down. Scientists and trust in science is still extremely important to the American public. And I think COVID is one of those issues that highlights just how important science is to the public. And because science is so important, I mean, I think that is why we see very powerful political individuals try to politicize it, right? Because if you can politicize science to be on your side, then that gives your, whatever you're trying to argue more heft. And so that's why we often do see science politicized by very powerful people so they can try to get it on their side. So I think science, is still really strong in our federal agencies. I know scientists, the scientists who are there are really passionate and care a lot about what they do because the science that they're doing informs critical decisions that affect public health and safety. I mean, these are really important decisions that are affecting the air we breathe to, making sure that the food that we put in our bodies is safe to eat. It's pretty clear that people in this country still trust science quite a lot. And so it will be important to maintain science and good quality science and scientific integrity and decision making across the federal.
So there's a lot that can be said about this topic, not just in the executive branch, but also in the legislative branch with the recent COVID oversight hearings, which I'm very interested in. But you've been working really hard to create a toolkit for both a toolkit and a tracker for federal scientists. And how do you hope that these tools will help shape science policy and actually empower scientists?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reason why SciLight created that toolkit was because we know that the prior Trump administration politicized science and attacked science or sidelined science in decision making quite a lot. I actually did publish a paper with a former colleague who was a historian, and we looked back at attacks on science in the federal government under every administration dating back to President Eisenhower. And we can find an example of an attack on science under every single administration. It doesn't matter if it's a Democratic administration, it doesn't matter if it's a Republican administration. All leaders try to politicize science. And what we found was that the strategies that the Trump administration was using were not different than the strategies that other administrations have used to politicize science. But the frequency of attacks on science by the Trump administration was way higher than prior administrations. So to give you a comparison, the community, or I guess the scientific community, really considered the prior George W. Bush administration as one of the most hostile administrations to science. And under a tracker that is maintained by the Unit Concerned Scientist, under 8 years of George W. Bush, they recorded 98 attacks on science. Under the Trump administration, and it was part of these efforts, we recorded over 200 attacks on science, and that was in 4 years. So nearly double the amount of times that we saw an attack on science in half the time. So, that is what we're really concerned about. And so with the incoming Trump administration, We want to make sure that scientists in the federal government are aware of their rights and protections, that they're aware of the scientific integrity policies in place, so that if they see politicization of science, they know who to go to talk about that. They're scientific integrity officials, that they know the processes by which they can actually document an attack on science, or that they can document in their note taking when an attack on science is occurring. So there's different things that federal scientists can do depending on their comfort level to defend science in federal decision making. And that is so important because, as I mentioned before, these decisions, what science is informing, affect public safety, the health of our environment. So these are things that are really, really critically important. So it's really important to make sure that good quality science, the best available science, is actually informing our decisions without being politically interfered with.
Thank you so much for that. And I think people don't realize how much science gets politicized, but your newsletter talks a lot about politicization of science. And it's interesting to see that happen in government. And it's kind of a little bit sad. And honestly, I have heard that, the great crazy thing about the government is it changes parties every few years and the executive branch completely changes. And so I have heard criticisms of politicization of science from Jerome Adams tweeted about the politicization of science by Democrats, but he has also actually been tweeting about politicization of science under the new Trump administration, which is really interesting. Thank you for your time. it's been amazing to chat with you, and thank you for the SciLight newsletter, which is one of my favorite newsletters.
Thank you so much for having me, Shiva. It's been a pleasure.